This program is made possible by Hay House, an international publisher helping people transform their lives through books, audios, and gifts that inform, enlighten, and inspire. On the web at www.hayhouse.com.
Thoreau put it this way. He said, our truest life is when we are in our dreams awake. Emerson, one of the people that we revere, who lived right here in Concord, said that the ancestor to every action is a thought. The energy that you have for creating what you want is in your thoughts.
Dr. Wayne Dyer is a best-selling author, lecturer, and modern philosopher. He holds a doctorate in counseling psychology and is America's leading teacher of transformational wisdom.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's a spiritual solution to every problem. It makes a very large claim, the title of this program. Where we are right now is perhaps the most fitting place we could be to talk about this subject. We're in Concord, Massachusetts, at the First Parish. If you look right up here to my right, there's a balcony, and Ralph Waldo Emerson and his family would come and sit there when they were children on Sundays. His grandfather, William Emerson, was the minister here when the shot that was heard around the world was fired that started the American Revolution, followed by the French Revolution and all of the changes that took place in the history of humanity. Much of it started right here at this First Parish, on this site where we are now seated. And this program is really about transcendent ideas. The idea that within each and every one of us, there is something much more that most of us haven't even begun to tap, that allows us to create for ourselves a solution to things that we have called problems in our lives. Transcendentalism was born here. And transcendentalism isn't an ism that you join. You don't pay any dues. You have to remember that back in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, there were things going on in this country and in this world that today we find intolerable. Slavery was an accepted practice at that time. But right here in Massachusetts, in Concord, people like Emerson and Bronson Alcott, who was the father of Louisa May Alcott, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Henry David Thoreau, people who would come to the school of philosophy and talk about ideas about how to abolish such things as slavery. All of those ideas and more. The idea that somehow this notion that we are wicked, or that we are born in sin, or that there's something wrong with us as people. All of this was being discussed here in this place, in this beautiful place where new transcendent ideas took place. I was introduced to these kinds of ideas when I was a young boy. I was a sophomore in Detroit on the east side at Denby High School. And I had a biology teacher. And my biology teacher was a very well-meaning, a very nice man. When I was a young boy, I was a sophomore, and he asked me if I would, and as he did everybody else in the class, if we would like to pass biology, that we would like to turn in something called a leaf collection. Now, I had already passed leaves. I had identified all the leaves that there were to identify and gotten a good grade on them. But he said, no, you have to do something more. You have to collect a whole bunch of them and turn them in for an assignment and prove that you have seen them. And I told him, in probably not the most diplomatic of ways, I won't be doing that. It just doesn't make any sense to me. At that time, there were some tough things going on in my own family, and I was working, and my mom was going through a hard time, and there was a divorce situation taking place, and it just seemed like a waste of time to me. And I've always kind of been one of those people who, and I'm not saying that I encourage this, I'm just saying that I recognize it as a trait that I've lived with my entire life. That doing things that just didn't make sense were something that I always at least questioned. And more than questioned, I took the consequences. I think probably the most famous line out of William Shakespeare is a line that is most quoted because it is that which tells us an enormous truth. To be or not to be. That is the question. And it's a very powerful and important question to ask yourself. Am I going to be? Am I not going to be? But the lines that followed it were even more significant. Whether 'tis nobler in the minds of men to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and thus by opposing end them. And so you have to always ask yourself that question. I think I was doing that. I didn't quote Shakespeare in those days. But I knew that doing things that didn't seem right or didn't make sense or were just being done because everybody else did them didn't fit in. And when I told my biology teacher that I wouldn't be doing that, he sent me to the principal's office. And I sat in the principal's office on this bench that had been worn smooth by generations of people just like myself, waiting to see the principal. And I waited a Monday and then a Tuesday and a Wednesday, and finally on Thursday morning I was escorted into the principal's office. And he informed me that everybody had to do the leaf collection and I was no better than anybody else. And if I didn't do it, I would be taking biology over again in the summer. But in those 3 days that I waited for the principal to make his decision about what my consequences were going to be, they left books for us to read, hoping somehow that perhaps even if we didn't read it just by osmosis, just by sitting next to it, perhaps some of this wisdom would come to us. And one of the books that they left there for us to read was written by a man who came into this church and who lived right here in this town. His name was Henry David Thoreau, and it was called Walden Pond. And I read through Walden, and it was all about nature, and it was all about sort of having a great reverence for all that is natural. But at the back of that particular edition, there was an essay that he had written. And the essay was called On the Necessity of Civil Disobedience. And I'd like to recommend to any of you who are running schools, if you have children that you are trying to get to conform and to fit in and to be just like everybody else, don't have them read Thoreau. And don't tell them to read Emerson's essay on self-reliance, which also happened to be at the back of this particular edition. And in that particular essay, he was talking about the importance of taking a stand against things that you thought were foolish, and about not just fitting in and not just being what everybody else tells you should be. And by the time Thursday got in there and I went into the principal's office, I felt like I was an American philosopher. I felt like I was someone that should be in there being recognized and have books written about, rather than someone being told to write a leaf collection. And I had a girlfriend at that time. Her name was Mary Jo, and Mary Jo was one of those people that we called curve breaker. She didn't just do a leaf collection. She would have it indexed, and she would have it color-coded, and she would send to Australia for eucalyptus leaves. And she offered to even do it for me, and I said, no, it's a matter of principle. I said, it just doesn't make sense to make people do things just for the reason of fitting in and being just like everybody else. And that was my introduction to transcendentalism. And Thoreau became someone that I had great admiration for. And Emerson, who was considered to be America's teacher, I had incredible respect for. Thoreau had a wonderful definition of success in that essay. He said, if you advance confidently in the direction of your own dreams and endeavor to live the life which you have imagined, you will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. And it's always been my very favorite definition of success. advancing confidently, making the decisions that make sense to you, being independent of the good opinion of everyone else out there, trusting in here that this is why I'm here, and there's music playing inside of me, and I must let that music come out. And too many of us don't. When I say a spiritual solution to every problem, I'd like everybody in the audience to just do me a favor, if you will. I'd like you to just point to yourself. Everybody, just for 1 second, just point to yourself. And just look around and just notice how people are. And notice that nobody's doing this. Not one person in the room is doing this. Why is that? Because who we are is not here. Who we are is what? Here. And where have you all pointed to? You pointed to your heart. Shakespeare again put it this way. He said, "Go to thy bosom, knock there, and ask your heart what it doth know." What it doth know. Listening to your heart is what, to me, represents the approach to a spiritual solution to every problem. There's 3 words in that title, in the title of this program: spiritual, solution, and problem. I'd like to just take a brief look at each one of them and what they mean to me. I'd like to take the word problem first. You know, I've been studying something for several years, and the thing that I've been studying is called A Course in Miracles. And A Course in Miracles is a very interesting collection of brilliant writing that I think if the world were living by it, perhaps we would have far, far fewer of the conflicts and struggles and so on that we have amongst ourselves and amongst nations and in our families and so on. And one of the lines that I came across in studying A Course in Miracles hit me very, very strongly. And this line, I couldn't get it out of my head. And here's what it said in there. It said, "You do not have any problems. You only think you do." You do not have any problems. You only think you do. Our problems are things that we carry around inside of us. And if we could recognize that these things that we call problems, no matter what they are, and I'm not here standing up here talking to you on television telling you that, the financial concerns that you face every day, the struggles that you face in your relationships, the whether or not you're going to be able to handle the health concerns and challenges that are facing you, all of these things that have come into our lives that we have labeled problems. But I'd like you to just remind yourself of where they are. They're not out there. They're in here. And they all represent something that I call energy. And one of my very favorite people in all the world, because he was not only a great scientist and a great thinker, but he was a great humanitarian as well. He would have really done well here in Concord. His name was Albert Einstein. And Einstein once said, "Nothing happens until something moves." Nothing happens until something moves. Everything is movement. Things look solid to us. You know, this watch on my arm looks solid. But if I were to take a microscope and turn up the magnification and look at this thing under a very, very strong microscope, you would see that it's really a dance. It's alive. It has molecules. Inside those molecules, there are all kinds of tiny little atoms. Inside those atoms are electrons and neutrons and protons and croutons and whatever it is, all of these things that we memorized when we were in physical science classes and so on. And then we have a new thing called quantum physics, and we look inside of these electrons and we find subatomic particles and subatomic particles. And what we've discovered through all of this is that everything is just energy. And you're watching a television set right now. And that television set has something coming into your home called energy. And you are looking at it, so there's visual energy, and you're hearing sound, you're hearing my voice right now, so there's something in the air between your receiver and my speaking here right now, something called sound waves, and they're all just energy. And if we were to understand how that energy comes into us, it comes into us through our senses, through our ears and through our eyes. And if we were to block off our ears and take all of the energy that was coming in the room into our ears, but before it hit our ears, we were to send it off to a scientist and say, give me a report, please, on this energy. They would send out the report and they'd come back and you'd look at it and you'd say, well, what's in there? What is this? And they'd say, well, there's a lot of movement. There's a lot of energy. Some of it's very fast. Some of it's very low. Some of it's high. Some of it's low. I'd say, but are there any problems in this report? They'd say, no, there's no problems in the energy. It just comes in high and it comes in low. It comes in fast and it comes in slow. And you know, that's one of the most important principles that you can learn and master in terms of identifying things that we call problems. That energy only becomes something that we convert into problems when we put it into our head and begin to process it in a certain way. And as we process it in certain ways, we tell ourselves, these things are going to get worse, or this is a terrible experience that I'm going through, or my finances are, or I've just had this terrible bout with a disease, or whatever it might be. And all of it is something that we carry around with us. What I'd like you to do sometime is open up the Torah, or the Old Testament, and look at the opening line of the Old Testament, of the Torah. And the opening line of the Torah, these ancient spiritual texts that we all rely upon and live by. And it says, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Most of us have gotten through at least Genesis 1:1, all right? And we understand that. Now you move ahead 31 lines later, and it says, and all that God created was good. Now we're presented with an enormous conundrum, a difficulty in our minds. Everything was created by God, and everything that God created was good. Therefore, how do we ever explain bad? How do we explain evil? How do we explain problems? How do we explain so many of these things that are so much a part of our lives, of our consciousness? You have to see that these are all things that came about when we invented something called the ego. And this ego is nothing more than an idea that we carry around. And this idea that we carry around says that who I am is separate from this source, this perfection into which I was created. That I am separate from it. And as a result of being separate from it, I am what I have, I am what I do, I am what everybody else out there thinks of me, I am my reputation, I am separate from everybody else, and I am separate from God. The other line that came to me in A Course in Miracles, where it uses the word problem, said this: if you do have a problem, the only problem you have is your belief that you are separate from your source. The moment that we took on this idea that we were separate from our source and no longer believed in our own integrity of our own mind, the moment that we took on that, we began to develop something called problems, something called illusions. And I'd like to suggest to you that every problem that we have, the way I see it, is nothing more than a mistake or an illusion. And how do we do something about these mistakes that we have? They are in our minds. You know, it says very clearly in most of the spiritual literature, as a man thinketh, so is he. Emerson, one of the people that we revere, who lived right here in Concord, said that the ancestor to every action is a thought. Once you start to understand that what you think about, your thoughts, is what expands and becomes your life, you start getting real careful about what you think about. Real careful. So that when you have a thought that says, gee, I got a sniffle, it's in my nose, but tomorrow it'll probably be down here in my throat. And on Wednesday, it's probably going to be here in my chest. Always seems to happen this way. And on Thursday, I'm going to have a fever. I get one every time. You can just about count on it. I'm going to have to take Friday off. Now, it's Monday morning, and you got a sniffle, but in your mind, in your thoughts, you're taking Friday off with a fever, and lo and behold, your body begins to react to this thought, which is just a mistake of the intellect to begin with. Supposing that you had a belief system that said 2 + 2 is 7. For some reason, you were just hung up on this idea. And you said 2 + 2 is 7, and you took your calculator and you reformulated it in such a way so that it would appear to be 2 + 2 is 7. And then you tried to balance your checkbook, and you tried to make your life work based upon this formulation, that 2 + 2 is 7. You would find that your life would be out of balance financially virtually all of the time. Every time you push that button and push those numbers, nothing would ever work. So the question is, what do I do in order to correct this mistake in my thinking? And that's where the word solution comes in. But we can't bring the solution in until we understand that everything that we have, do you know that every relationship that you're in right now, every single person watching this, every relationship you're in is in your mind. You can't get behind the eyeballs of another human being and be them. All you can do is process them through your thoughts. Now, if your thoughts about the person that you love are about what is wrong, about what you don't like, about what they ought to be, about what they used to be, about how they disappoint you, about how bad they talk, about their language, about anything at all, if that's what you're thinking about, what you think about is what expands, more of what you're thinking about will continue to show up in your life, whether you like it or not. It's one of the great ironies. I always tell people that if you understood this concept, the best way to do it is to put it in terms of money. If I had $1 million, and I were to take this $1 million and I were to give it to you, and I'd say, this purpose of this $1 million is for you to go out to the mall, and every store you come to where you see something that you really like, you're to purchase it. Any place you go, whatever you like, you purchase it. So you take this $1 million and say, this is great. You walk into the first store that you see, and there's a rug there that's just appalling. It's hideous. It's just awful. It doesn't match anything in your house, and it costs $10,000. And you look at that thing and you say, ugh, I would never want that. Here's $10,000. Send it home. Now you go to the next store in the mall, and it's got a lamp in it that matches the rug, all right? And you look at this hideous lamp and you say, that's the worst looking thing I've ever seen. Send 2 of those home, and they cost $5,000 a piece. So far, you've taken your money and you've spent $20,000 of it on what you don't want. And all day long, every time you saw something that you didn't want, you spent your energy, your money, on sending it home. Then you get home and you say to yourself, why is my house filled with all of this stuff that I don't want? And the answer is, you're crazy. This is called insanity. You have energy to spend it on what you do want, yet you continue to use it to purchase what you don't want. And the metaphor here is that your thoughts work exactly the same way. The energy that you have for creating what you want is in your thoughts. And if you want your relationship to be divine and to be perfect and to be beautiful, then you have to begin to think the kinds of thoughts that are going to create that for you. If, on the other hand, you put your thoughts on what the person isn't, what they ought to be, what they used to be, what you think is wrong, you'll see more of that showing up. And it works in everything in your life. Changing your mind, changing your thoughts is how we change the problems, if you will, that we face in our life. Okay? Now, the word spiritual, there's a spiritual solution to every problem. I am not speaking here about anything that has to do with organized religion or anybody else's religion. I respect everybody's right to worship and be a part of any organization that they choose. And I'm not here to recruit anybody. I don't belong to any organizations. I'm not here trying to convince you to be something other than just a happier, more fulfilled person who can understand that there is a means to bringing a spiritual solution to things in your life that you don't like. These illusions, these mistakes that you have made. Because remember, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, and all that was created was good. So that anything that isn't good has come about because of your belief in your mind that you are separate from this divinity. You are not what you have. You are not what you do. You are not what others think of you. You are the beloved. You are the divine. You are a creation that is made into perfection. When I use the word spiritual, I'm speaking now about a way of being. I'm speaking about not being a Buddhist, but being Buddha-like. I'm speaking about not being a Christian, but being Christ-like. I'm speaking about not being a Muslim, but being Muhammad-like. I'm speaking about a way of living which includes specifics, unconditional love, the ability to be able to send love in response to hate, in response to anger, in response to fear, the ability to live that. I'm speaking about the understanding that who I am is not a human being here having a spiritual experience, but it's the reverse. That who I am is really a spiritual being having a human experience. And so there's an infinite part of me. There's a part of me that was never born. There's a part of me that never dies. I've often said that one of the keys to higher awareness is having the ability to step outside of who you are and just become the observer to your life. And when you do that, you tune into the infinite. Carl Jung, one of the greatest teachers, I think, that ever walked on this planet, once said that the telling question of a person's life is their relationship to the infinite. Once you have that relationship to the infinite, I remember I wrote a book a few years ago. It's called Your Sacred Self. And in this book, I talked about the distinction between the ego, this part of us that wants to prove that we're right, and the part of us that wants to be at peace. And a woman came up to me at a talk, and she was one of these people who was going to give me some feedback about my book. And she said, she said, I read your book, and I didn't get anything out of it. I said, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. She said, the only thing I can tell you that I got out of it is that now, after reading it, I no longer have a fear of dying. I said, that's all you got out of one book? This thing that all of us are always in dread of, and you read that? She said, yeah. She said, it just seemed like I understood that I'm an infinite soul after reading that. I said, well, perhaps that was the message that you had to learn, So to me, spiritual means also it means becoming quiet. It means being able to make conscious contact with your source, to no longer have a sense of everything has to be loud. I have to be constantly talking. For me, meditation is such an important part of my life. I tell people who say they don't have time to meditate, I say, you're in a car, aren't you? You drive back and forth to work? I say, well, yes, I do that at 30 minutes each way. I said, well, how often each day do you think you spend at a red light? The person will say, well, I stop at least 6 or 7 times. I say, that's maybe 1 or 2 minutes each time. They say, yes. I'll say, what I do at red lights is I just stop because my car has come to a stop and my body is in the car, so therefore it has come to a stop. The only thing that's usually still going is my mind. All right? So I say to people, take that minute or two to close your eyes, take a few deep breaths, and make conscious contact with your source. Reconnect to your source. There's always somebody behind you to let you know when your minute is up. It never fails. All right? Most of us don't understand that this business of making conscious contact can be illustrated, and if you get it, understand it. See, I think of my source as the ocean, and I think of myself as a glass. And if I were to take this glass and I were to dip it into this ocean of abundance and say, what do I have here? What I have here is a glass of my source. Now, it's not as big, and it's not as strong, but it is still a glass of my source to which I am always connected. And if I were to take one drop of this source, and I were to put it over here, and I were to say to this drop of water, I would like you to create and sustain life. I would like you to perform miracles. I would like you to end all of my problems. And you watch that drop of water, separate from its source, you would see that it's going to change form from liquid into gas. And eventually it'll return to its source. There's no place else that it can go. There's only one source. But while this drop of water is separate from its source, it loses all of the power of its source. And this drop of water, separate from its source, is a symbol or a metaphor